Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to talk about Red Bull's decision to swap Lawson and Tsunoda. So a couple days ago, I think Thursday or so, it was the news broke. Tsunoda is to replace Lawson at the Red Bull from the Japanese Grand Prix as the New Zealander drops down to Racing Bulls, and that's basically from the official F1 site, I believe, Thursday or so. So for this video, first I want to take a look at the data, both qualifying and the race. Then we're going to compare it to some of Verstappen's past teammates. We're going to compare it to some historical data as well, and then talk about some other more contextual stuff to kind of try to understand this decision, why it was made, and maybe talk a bit about where do things go from here. So first, taking a look at qualifying data. So this is the Lawson's delta to Verstappen from our three qualifying sessions that we've had in those two races. Normally, I wouldn't use sprint qualifying data, but it's only two races. So again, 3 sessions is a little bit better than 2 from a data perspective. That first race in Australia, out-qualified by Verstappen by 1.076 seconds. Sprint qualifying, out-qualified by Verstappen by 0.813 seconds. And then the main qualifying session for the Chinese Grand Prix, 0.75 seconds. And that final session actually flatters Lawson somewhat. Verstappen only did one run towards the start of the session on, I believe, a used set of soft tires, whereas Lawson did two runs, one at the beginning, one at the end, where the track had gripped up quite a bit. So if Verstappen had done a second run at the end of Q1, that gap is probably over a second, if not a bit more. In terms of just raw placement, that first qualifying session qualified P18. The second and third, both in China. He infamously at this point qualified P20, dead last for both of those sessions. Again, median of those 3 sessions, 0.8 of a second, definitely not good enough, just not fast enough in qualifying. And for reference, taking a look at the median qualifying gaps to his 3 previous teammates against Gasly, it was 0.405 seconds, Albon 0.493 seconds, and then for Perez, 0.436 seconds. So again, all 3 of those previous drivers are in the 4/10ths range. For Perez, for sure, end of last year was definitely trending upwards towards 5/10, 6/10 quite regularly. But over those 4 years, again, not too bad. So the fact that, right out of the gate, these 3 races, Lawson's had like 3 absolutely terrible sessions where he's basically hasn't even gone within, 7/10 of Verstappen. Now, taking a look at the races themselves. So, first race this season, of course, crashed out in Australia. The fact that he crashed out, not too big of a deal, given that we also had Hadjo crashing out on the formation lap. We had Doohan crashing out on the first lap, along with Sainz. We had Alonso in the wall around lap 30 or so, and Gabriel Bortoleto also crashed out. So, the point being, there were a lot of crashes in that Grand Prix. So, the fact that Lawson was one of them, not, super surprising. Again, I don't think the fact that he crashed was, super damning of him or was a particularly large part of the reason why he was eventually dropped. But when we look at race pace gaps, it's definitely not a pretty picture. So for Australia, this is from lap 1 to lap 34. So I'm just doing this based on the calculation from the highlights on YouTube. But basically, when the yellow flag came out for Alonso's crash, I basically just added up all the intervals between drivers between Verstappen and Lawson, and that was 81.015 seconds. And when you basically convert that into seconds per lap, it comes out to 2.382. Now, of course, there is the caveat here that when you're at the back of the field and you're trying to make your way through, being stuck behind slower cars will slow you down quite a bit, but still being 2.3 seconds a lap is pretty bad. And that doesn't even account for the fact that we had a safety car for the first 5 laps. So if I'd done the calculation correctly, that gap's probably around 2.8, 2.9 seconds a lap, which again is pretty horrific. In China, not much better. Again, one last thing for Australia. For Australia, of course, it's a street circuit, pretty narrow, pretty hard to overtake. So again, bit more slack given there. But in China, purpose-built circuit, again, not the most difficult track to overtake at. But in the Chinese sprint, he was 35.1 seconds behind Verstappen, over 19 laps in the sprint. That came out to 1.847 seconds a lap. Grand Prix a little bit better. He was 64.491 seconds behind, but again, still 1.151 seconds a lap. So it's not just an issue in qualifying. His pace in the race was also a big problem. All three of the first, those three competitive sessions, over a second a lap slower than his teammate Verstappen on average. And again, even if you just go by the placements, crashed in the Australian Grand Prix, Chinese Sprint, finished 12th. Again, that was probably the best of the three sessions. And then in the main Grand Prix, finished 15th on the road and then was promoted to 12th with the 3 disqualifications ahead. And tire management was also a big problem. Being on the same strategy as Stroll and Behrman, they both on that opening stint with the hard tires, they, I think, went at least 10 laps longer than Lawson was able to do. So, again, race pace, tire management, all those things were big problems in those 2 Grand Prix 3 races that we had. Now, to try to contextualize this a little bit more. So these are the largest teammate quality gaps since 2000, so in basically the last 25 years. And I've basically removed a couple of the data points. So there's a couple with, I think, Sakon Yamamoto at Super Aguri, and then the following year at Spiker 2007, where we basically did a 5 and a 6 race stint. Those would have been in here, but I've basically done all the sessions, all the stints, teammate combinations where it's more than 10 races, just to try to make the sample size a little bit bigger. But number one, Mark Webber and Alex Yoon, 2002. Webber, median qualifying gap to Yoon, 1.403 seconds. Number two, Fernando Alonso, Tarso Marquez in 2001, 1.325 seconds. I've read out online actually that for the Minardi in 2001, Alonso's car was actually made with different components and it was quite a bit lighter than Marquez. And that, of course, would mean that would be a faster car. So apparently, there isn't really any accurate way to quantify the gap between Alonso and Marquez, but still, I think pretty unquestionably, Alonso was definitely the better of the 2 drivers. Number 3, Mark Webber again, 2003, the following year, against Antonio Pizzonia, 0.866 seconds. Number 4, Kamui Kobayashi and Marcus Ericsson, 2014, 0.847 seconds. And number 5, Julian Palmer and Nico Hulkenberg in 2017, 0.83 seconds. And then coming in, if you were to include Lawson Verstappen, that would be number 6 on the list. And one of the big differences I would say between Lawson, Verstappen, and all of these 5 is that all these 5 are in relatively slow cars. And again, being in a slower car, pressure is going to be off. And again, for some of these, the early 2000s, for sure, especially, it was a different era. There wasn't a super license system. Pay drivers could basically just come in if they had the money and they could race in Formula One, which of course is not the case now. The quality of the grid, at least the bottom end of the grid, is much, much higher than it was 25 years ago. And of course, is the fact that, Red Bull still, a front-running team, expectations are going to be much, much higher than at like a backmarker like the early 2000s Minardi's. Now, again, for reference, you can say, well, this is only 3 qualifying sessions. Give him more time. Lawson will start having sessions where, he's within, 7.5 tenths of a second. But, even looking at that, so I've basically compiled all the qualifying sessions that Perez, Gasly, and Albon did, again, compared to Max Verstappen. And we've basically split it into the ones where the gap was above 7.5 tenths and the ones where it's below 7.5 tenths. So for Perez, about 30% of the time, the gap was bigger than 7.5 tenths. And of course, this is in Verstappen's favor. For Gasly, it was about 33%. So again, a little bit bigger than Perez. But for Albon, only 16% of the time. So actually was consistently a little bit closer than this kind of arbitrary cutoff than either Perez, Gasly, and of course Lawson. So again, it kind of shows that those 3 previous teammates, even though they did have the qualifying sessions where they were, over 7.5 tenths off of Verstappen, they were pretty rare. And the fact that you have 3 of them in a row is, again, pretty unlikely. So, it does kind of show that this is something where I would expect Lawson would probably improve quite a bit as the season gets long. But I do think that, if he's struggling this much right now, I do think that, there is going to be a limit to how much he would be able to improve. And I think even, let's say, he'd been able to stay in the car until the summer break, perhaps that median qualifying gap goes down to about 6 tenths maybe, I think realistically at best. Now, the other thing that's, I think, really going against Lawson here is the fact that the grid is much tighter than it was even 6-7 years ago. So we've gotten the qualifying data from Chinese Grand Prix 2025, so the one that we had last weekend, and the 2019 Grand Prix, which of course was Gasly's, I believe, third race with Red Bull that year. So at the 2019 Chinese Grand Prix, Gasly qualified 8.5 tenths off of Max Verstappen, but that, because of the way that the gaps were between the big three teams, Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, and everyone else, qualifying 8.5 tenths off Verstappen still meant that he qualified P6. Now, for Lawson at the Chinese Grand Prix this past weekend, qualified 7.5 tenths off of Verstappen, and that left him P20 and knocked out in Q1. So I think the reality is the gaps between the midfield, the back markers, and the front runners are much, much smaller than they were even 6 years ago. And this means that a bad qualifying session by any of these drivers, not just Lawson, in a front running machinery, means that realistically you're probably going to be out in Q1. And that's unfortunately something that Lawson is kind of the reality that Lawson has to deal with that Gasly didn't have to deal with in 2019. And again, if you look at, and this is not just, a one race, like a one-off, where it was only that specific Grand Prix. This is a graph looking at the quality percentiles from 2010 to 2024. So the blue line's basically the 25% percentile for basically the pole gap. The red line's 50%, and then the yellow is 75%. So you can see for 2019, if you basically look at where the midfield gap is, the red dot for 2019. So it's here. We'll go and get the cursor over there. So this is a red dot for 2019. It's about 102%, and that was kind of the median over the whole season. And then again, if you take that line and going across all the way to 2024, that's basically where the 75th percentile line now is. So it basically shows that the F1 the gaps between the whole grid have basically gotten tighter and tighter every year. And again, 2025 data is not included here as we've only had 2 races or 2 main qualifying sessions, but I would expect the gaps to again decrease as well this year before probably increasing next year with the new regulations. But it just kind of shows that, unfortunately for Lawson, the reality is gaps are really, really small, and those kind of quality gaps are punished much more harshly than they were 5-10 years ago. Now, in my preseason, so again, this is in my preseason predictions for each team. I basically did I showed what the quality model had basically predicted was the gaps between each of the 10 teammate pairings for this year. So taking a look at this, this kind of, I think, partially highlights the issue with this kind of model. And I've basically have been developing a new model to replace this. And I've kind of shown it in a couple of videos recently, but this kind of shows, why sometimes these models aren't very good. But so this basically, it shows, so the numbers on the page are basically the age and experience corrected gaps between all these teammates, and the numbers are in reference to the number to the driver on the left. So for example, Verstappen, over his tenure with Gasly, age corrected and experience corrected, it was about 3 and 8 tenths in Verstappen's favor. And then again, Gasly to Tsunoda, 3.1 tenths. And when you do these kinds of things to try to predict kind of, future teammate gaps, it obviously does assume that, every driver is going to tap to every car the same. So for example, for Tsunoda and Verstappen, if you look at just the gaps relations with respect to Ricardo, for example, that would suggest that Tsunoda would actually be better than Verstappen. Of course, I don't think that's the case. 99% of people also probably don't think that's the case. And I think the really tricky thing with these kinds of models is that not every driver adapts to every car the same. And that's something that's very, very difficult to analyze. So again, with the predicted gap of 0.407 in Verstappen's favor, again, I think that would have been reasonable. And if Lawson had been doing that for these 3 qualifying sessions, I think he would still be at the team right now. So I think really what's going on is you have this, we'll just assume that the model's right. And we'll say that that predicted gap between Verstappen and Lawson of 4/10 of a second is actually, somewhere what there should be. If assuming the car is, easy to drive, it's fast, it's, relatively balanced, doesn't, benefit one driver's steering handling style too much in one way, but that really flies in the face of the real gap, which is of those 3 sessions, again, 0.813 seconds. I think part of the reason why that gap is so much bigger in reality than what it's predicting, I think what most people really thought, and probably what Red Bull thought as well, is that I think there's a couple things going on. So one is that I think this year's Red Bull is a very, very difficult car to drive. If you go and look at the onboards for both Verstappen and for Lawson, it's a very, very difficult car to control through the corners. On corner entry, it understeers a lot, and it also has random snaps of oversteer on corner exit. It's just a very, very tricky car to deal with, and one for a driver with only 11 Grand Prix starts coming into the season. I think Lawson just had a very, very hard time coping with it. I think as a consequence of that, he has very, very little confidence in the car. He's not able to push. And you can looking at the telemetry, looking at his onboards, he's pushing too much in certain corners, not pushing enough in others, and so he's just bleeding lap time everywhere. And so I think those kind of combination of things, plus, on top of the already kind of natural pace gap between Verstappen and Lawson, means that he's just basically completely lost, and the gaps are much, much too big to be acceptable for Red Bull. Now, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but there's basically been talk online about, how good is the Red Bull actually? Is it actually, perhaps the Racing Bulls, the junior team, is actually the faster car? Now, looking at the data, it's hard to say. I think looking at just the main qualifying sessions for Australia and China, I think you could make an argument, at least over one lap, that the Racing Bulls is actually a better car. The sprint result for China, not so much, but let's take a look. So the first two bars, light blue, those are where Tsunoda was the leading Racing Bulls car. The royal blue, the darker one, that is, of course, from Hajar, when Hajar set the leading time in Q3 for the Chinese Grand Prix qualifying. So that first racing in Australia, Verstappen was only 0.189 seconds ahead of Tsunoda. Sprint qualifying for China, Verstappen was 0.906 seconds above Tsunoda. Then final session, Chinese qualifying session, Verstappen was 0.262 seconds ahead of Hajar. So I would say, taking a look at the Australian main qualifying session, is Verstappen more than 2/10 faster than Tsunoda in equal machinery? Well, we're about to find out the answer to that question, but I think most people would say probably yes. Same with Hajar. Is Verstappen about 2.5 faster than 2.5 seconds than a rookie Hajar who's only in his second F1 Grand Prix? I think most people would say probably yes as well. So looking at the main qualifying sessions, I think you could make an argument that, the Red Bulls may be the fifth best car in qualifying. Of course, the Chinese sprint, probably a bit of an outlier there. So again, you have two sessions on one hand where you could say perhaps Racing Bulls is the faster car, but the sprint for the Chinese Grand Prix is probably the other way. We say no, Red Bull's probably the faster car there. But I think at this point, very, very small sample size, so I think you can make an argument either way. And again, that's something that was definitely not helping Lawson, as he's definitely struggled so much in qualifying. Now, of course, the big historical comparison to this is, honestly, there aren't very many historical comparisons in front-running machinery where a driver has basically gone in, been so far off the pace, and then sacked, at least in recent memory. So the closest one we have is 2009 at Ferrari, where Luca Badoer was basically drafted in to replace Felipe Massa after his accident at the 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix. Now, Badoer had been a test driver for Ferrari for many, many years, but he hadn't really had a full-time race seat in pretty much, I think, a decade or so. So again, this was kind of just putting him in kind of as a reward, I guess, for his hard work, and I guess Ferrari didn't really have anyone else. I know initially Michael Schumacher was actually the one who was supposed to do it, but he unfortunately suffered a neck injury with a motorbike crash. Just before Massa's accident. So he unfortunately wasn't able to, take Massa's spot. So again, they were kind of forced to go with Bador, and he only unfortunately lasted 2 Grand Prix. So that first Grand Prix, the European Grand Prix, which was in Valencia, he qualified P20, 2.57 seconds off his teammate Raikkonen, who eventually qualified P6. In the race, ended up P17, a lap down, whereas his teammate Raikkonen ended up on the podium. The second race, the Belgian Grand Prix, again qualified P20, 1.378 seconds off of Raikkonen, who qualified P6, and in the race finished P14, 102.177 seconds off of Raikkonen, who won that Grand Prix. He was eventually replaced after that Belgian Grand Prix with Giancarlo Fisichella, who's also pictured in that photo. Again, Fisichella got that super unexpected podium at that race, and basically Ferrari were like, hey, let's sign him for the rest of the season. Surely he could do a bit better than Bador. And of course he was a little bit better than Bador. Median qualifying gap over those 5 races was actually about a second, but there's one big outlier there and super small sample size. Otherwise it would have been a median gap of about like 6/10 or so. Still not great, but again a bit better than what Lawson has showed. So again, there isn't really a lot of historical precedent. And again, with Bador, he hadn't been Grand Prix racing in a decade, didn't have any preseason testing, probably had testing with the car, given that there was a lot less restrictions on testing at the time, but still not a great showing from Bador at that stint. So what comes next? What do Red Bull do now? So Helmut Marko has basically confirmed that Yuki Tsunoda is going to be staying at Red Bull for the remainder of the 2025 season, no matter how bad things could potentially get. This will likely be, Tsunoda will be driving the entire season. For Lawson, this is kind of a chance for him to try to rebuild his career, try to get things back on track. He's performed relatively well at Racing Bulls 2023-2024, but I do think that there's going to be a fair amount of pressure on him, both within season and to, potentially retain his seat for 2026. Red Bull do have a young junior driver, Arvid Lindblad, racing in Formula 2, already has the points for the super license, but he is 17, so he would need permission from the FIA to basically get that super license and then be able to drive in Formula 1. So we'll see how this goes. I do think for Lawson, his job right now is to try to beat Hadjar as soundly as possible, beat him almost every qualifying session if he can, and again, be consistently better than him in the races. And I think if he's able to do that, he should either do enough to keep his seat for 2026 or perhaps attract interest from, a Cadillac, let's say. For Tsunoda, it's a pretty difficult situation. Obviously, the car is quick in the hands of Max Verstappen, but it seems like the car is very, very, very difficult to get on top of and to drive to that potential. So for Tsunoda, I think really the benchmark, the job is going to be to try to do better than Lawson. Again, the bar is very, very low, but again, he's going to want to try to be in the same benchmark as Albon, Gasly, and Perez, at least to start. Try to be 4.4 of a second off in qualifying, and in the races probably try to be within 2 to 3 positions and be consistently in the points almost every Grand Prix. Again, he is also without a contract at the end of the year. His first 5 years at Red Bull are kind of up with the end of this season. Of course, with Honda leaving, it's a very, very difficult situation for him where he could basically do really well, stay with Red Bull perhaps for next year, or he could flame out and be out of F1 entirely if things go badly. I think as well, this was probably a move that was done too early. I think I honestly would have given Lawson the upcoming triple header of Japan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. He knows Japan very well from Super Formula and F1, knows Bahrain from testing, and Saudi Arabia he knows from Formula 2, which is a bit more than he knows than China or Australia, which we just had. But my guess is, Red Bull probably saw data in stuff in the data, saw that the gap was as big as it was, and again, even with assuming that he was going to improve, a fair amount over the course of the season, let's say that the qualifying gap improves to only being half a second, that's still going to be likely being knocked out in Q1 or Q2 at many Grand Prix this season. And again, the race pace gaps were just too big. If things had continued the way they were, with Red Bull being a good but not great car, I could see, I could have seen Lawson ending up with, 20 to 30 points over the whole season, with Verstappen maybe sitting on, 300 points, which would have been, absolutely a massive gap in terms of just points and everything. Again, there's rumors as well that, again, this hasn't been officially confirmed, but apparently Honda are paying extra money as well for Tsunoda to be promoted to Red Bull. And the fact that the next Grand Prix is the Japanese Grand Prix, Honda's home race, Tsunoda's home race, I don't think it's a big coincidence that Red Bull basically decided to pull the trigger now. And, for Lawson, he didn't really have financial backing the way that Perez did. And so for Red Bull, I think it seems, last year or so, they've been making a lot of decisions based on, money and less based on, what makes sense at the time. So again, I think really that's all the main points. Oh yeah, the one last point that I wanted to make as well is that, again, not officially confirmed, but there is a possibility that Verstappen, who's again seeing all this chaos unfold around him, if he's rumored to have a clause in his contract where if Red Bull are below fourth or below third in the Constructors' Championship, he's basically able to walk away from that Red Bull contract and go and sign with another team. So if, Verstappen's teammates not scoring any points, very, very hard for Red Bull to stay above, I would say, fourth, stay above fourth in the Constructors' Championship. So I think that's also a possible motive for why they're trying to switch now, just kind of as a last-ditch effort to try to make sure that that doesn't happen, and Verstappen can't just walk over to Mercedes and ask for a 5-year contract and take Russell's seat. So again, very, very interesting, I think, what's happened the last couple of days. Again, if you're Lawson, definitely not very fun. Probably, one of the worst feelings in your life. For Tsunoda, probably the opposite. Probably very, very exciting, especially since he gets to debut as home race in Japan. But for the rest of us, a very, very interesting storyline to follow for the rest of the season. So again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. It really helps out. And I'll be back again probably next week with my preview of the Japanese Grand Prix. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.